June 15, 1944. Saipan. The sky over the western horizon was still the color of unfinished steel when Captain Elias Boone raised his binoculars for the third time that morning and felt the first break in the pattern. Naval bombardment had paused hours earlier, leaving the sea unnaturally calm. Its surface stretched smooth under the early light like something waiting to be written on. Boone stood on a jagged coral ridge overlooking the northern approach lanes, his boots grinding white fragments into powder as he adjusted his stance. Below him, the newly established American beachhead was fragile. Supply crates half-opened, stretcher teams moving steadily, Marines digging in while artillery inland continued its sporadic retaliation. Saipan was not secure. It was merely contested. The island smelled of salt, cordite, and crushed vegetation burned by pre-landing bombardment. Boone exhaled slowly and focused the lenses again. At first, what he saw registered as a trick of distance, a thin gray distortion where the water met the sky. But distortions do not move with formation discipline. He adjusted the focus ring with careful pressure, the same way he had done in North Africa when tracking convoy shadows across the Mediterranean. For silhouettes resolved first, then 6 low hulls, narrow wake trails, then something else, escort spacing. The vessels were not scattered. They were aligned with purpose, angled toward Saipan from the north, closing at a speed too deliberate to be accidental. Boone did not speak immediately. He counted again, tracking the relative distance between lead and flank. Troop transport draft. Likely light cargo. 1 destroyer-class escort off starboard rear. He lowered the binoculars and calculated in silence. The Marines below were still consolidating landing zones. The 2nd and 4th Divisions had only just pushed inland beyond the beach perimeter. Casualty clearing stations were already overflowing. Reinforcement lanes had been assumed to be severed by American naval dominance. That assumption was now dissolving in front of him. If those ships reached Saipan intact, Japanese command would double its coastal infantry density before U.S. forces had secured the central ridgeline. Boone understood what that meant. Urban resistance would harden. Artillery repositioning would accelerate. The battle would extend weeks longer. Casualties would multiply geometrically. He raised the binoculars again. There was no panic in him, only precision. He was from Chattanooga, Tennessee, raised along a river where morning fog often concealed movement until it was too late. He had learned early that distance deceives. During Operation Torch, he had watched German supply lines shift beneath thin camouflage nets and understood something most officers did not: wars pivot on what arrives unseen. Now the Pacific had presented him with the same equation. The convoy was not retreating. It was advancing, deliberate, timed, likely moving under the assumption that dawn air cover would not fully rotate for another 40 minutes. He felt the weight of that window settle like gravity. He radioed once, giving bearing and estimated speed. Then he repeated the transmission. He did not speculate. He did not dramatize. He gave coordinates, vessel count, escort formation, and closing distance. Static answered. Then acknowledgement. Behind him, artillery thudded again from the interior of the island. Boone remained on the ridge. He did not move to the shade. He tracked the convoy through the glass as sunlight strengthened, turning the sea metallic. He could almost imagine the men aboard those transports, young, likely told they were reinforcing a defensive perimeter already collapsing. They would be expecting shore batteries to guide them in. Instead, they were entering a narrow corridor of the American carrier range. Boone checked his watch. 17 minutes. That was the time between his first transmission and the faint tremor of engines arriving high above the cloud line. The first Hellcats appeared like black punctuation marks against morning blue. The convoy shifted formation too late. The escort vessel broke outward, smoke blooming from its stack as it increased speed. Boone kept the lenses steady. Dive bombers descended in steep arcs, their engines cutting into the quiet with surgical violence. The first impact through water skyward in a white column taller than the hull itself. Then another. One transport caught fire midship. A second began listing almost immediately, its wake collapsing into erratic spirals. The sea that had been smooth minutes earlier fractured into oil and flame. Boone did not cheer. He adjusted magnification and counted survivors launching into water. The escort destroyer attempted withdrawal, smoke trailing unevenly. Within 6 minutes, the convoy's formation had disintegrated. Reinforcement never reached shore. The beachhead below him would hold. The inland artillery would not be doubled. The ridge line fight would unfold without sudden rear pressure. Boone lowered the binoculars only after confirming the final vessel's drift. Smoke rose vertically in still air. He felt no triumph, only a quiet recalibration. Saipan had not won, but its geometry had shifted. He wrote later in a letter to his sister, "I saw something that did not belong to us, and I understood immediately that it was meant to arrive before we were ready." He did not mention aircraft or explosions. He mentioned stillness. The sea was calm afterward, he wrote. That felt wrong, because what he understood, standing alone on coral and crushed limestone, was that wars often hinge not on fury, but on whether someone notices the wrong shape on the horizon and chooses to say it twice. The strike that followed Boone's transmission did more than destroy hulls. It altered tempo, and tempo in the Pacific theater was everything. By mid-morning, the horizon north of Saipan was no longer empty but scarred, thin black columns rising and flattening as they met the wind at higher altitude. From the beachhead below, Marines would later remember only the distant flashes and the faint thunder carried over water. Most never knew that the reinforcement convoy had been visible first through a single pair of lenses on a coral ridge. But the Japanese command did. Signals intelligence captured fragments of confusion that morning. Broken radio exchanges between convoy escorts and shore batteries at Marpy Point. Coordinates repeated, then corrected. Requests for updated American fleet positions. A final transmission from the destroyer escort, cut mid-sentence. What Boone had interrupted was not merely movement of men. It was synchronization. The Japanese plan for Saipan's defense depended on timed reinforcement arriving precisely when American landing forces were stretched thinnest, when supply dumps were most exposed and engineering units still unprotected by layered perimeter defenses. The convoy was meant to arrive just as Marine battalions rotated inland. Instead, it burned before touching shore. That difference compressed the Japanese defensive strategy inward. Without fresh infantry and ammunition, interior positions were forced to accelerate engagement earlier than planned. Banzai counterattacks that might have been staged later were triggered prematurely. Shore artillery repositioned before full reconnaissance. And in that acceleration, structural weaknesses surfaced. Boone would not see that unfolding directly. His vantage point offered sea and sky, not inland tactical maps. But by late afternoon he sensed the shift. Resistance from the northern ridge slackened. Mortar fire grew less coordinated. Even the rhythm of Japanese small arms, once methodical, became uneven. Reinforcement had not come. Somewhere inland, officers were recalculating without the men they expected to command. Boone descended the coral slope slowly, boots slipping in powdery limestone, and reported physically to the command post dug beneath camouflaged netting. He was asked twice to confirm numbers. He did, calmly. For transports, 1 escort, estimated 1,200 personnel lost or diverted. A staff major studied him a moment longer than necessary. "You're certain?" Boone answered without emphasis. "Yes, sir." He did not elaborate on how he had known before certainty was visible to others. That skill had been shaped earlier in the war, in places far from Saipan. During Operation Husky in Sicily, he had once spotted a German armored repositioning hours before Allied reconnaissance confirmed it. His superiors had initially dismissed the observation as misreading terrain shadows. Later they apologized quietly. Boone never repeated that story. What mattered was pattern recognition. Ships aligned at improper angles relative to prevailing current. Wake lines too disciplined for fishing craft. Silence on expected channels. War, he had learned, speaks most clearly when something fails to follow its natural behavior. That morning, the sea had behaved unnaturally. By evening, American aircraft continued sorties northward, ensuring no surviving transport circled back. Naval destroyers extended patrol arcs outward. The Japanese convoy had not only been neutralized, it had been denied narrative. There would be no story of reinforcements slipping through blockade to stiffen resistance. Instead, there would be absence. And absence exerts its own psychological pressure. In the days that followed, Saipan's battle intensified inland. Urban fighting through Garapan became brutal and intimate. Coral dust clung to sweat and blood alike. Engineers cleared bunkers with demolition charges while infantry moved in cautious bursts between shattered concrete. Casualties mounted. Yet historians would later note that the northern reinforcement corridor remained empty. The Japanese command had gambled on timing and lost it. Captain Elias Boone resumed routine reconnaissance tasks. He wrote another letter home on June 18th. This one mentioned heat, the flies, the sound of artillery echoing strangely across limestone cliffs. He did not mention the convoy again. For him, the moment had passed once action followed observation. But at higher echelons, the consequences rippled outward. Admiral Spruance's staff logged the interception as confirmation that Japanese naval intelligence underestimated American air coverage rotation. Carrier group repositioning was adjusted accordingly. The strike doctrine was refined. Within weeks, similar patterns were anticipated during the Philippine Sea engagements. Pattern recognition, once validated, becomes doctrine. And doctrine, once embedded, shapes entire campaigns. Boone did not claim credit. His official report occupies barely half a page in battalion archives. No decoration citation foregrounded the convoy. Yet veterans who survived Saipan's initial week later remarked how precarious those early days felt. How a single unexpected reinforcement might have collapsed the beachhead before it solidified. Boone himself rarely discussed it. Years later, when asked about Saipan by a junior officer during a stateside lecture, he responded simply, "You look where others assume nothing is coming." Then he changed the subject. The Pacific Campaign moved forward relentlessly. Guam, Tinian, Peleliu. Each island demanded its own arithmetic of observation and reaction. But June 15th remained a hinge. A convoy that did not arrive. A reinforcement that became smoke instead of formation. As dusk fell over Saipan that first day, Boone stood again briefly on the coral ridge. The sea had returned to apparent calm. Oil slicks dispersed into thin sheens reflecting sunset orange. There was no visible trace of hull or fire. War erases its disturbances quickly when water is involved. He considered how narrow the margin had been. 40 minutes later, an air cover might have rotated away. 10 minutes earlier, and haze might have concealed formation spacing. 90 seconds of hesitation before radio transmission might have allowed the convoy to disperse under darkness. War's turning points often compress into moments so brief they feel almost accidental. But they are not accidents. They are intersections between preparation and perception. Boone lowered his binoculars and finally allowed himself one private thought. Not triumph, not relief, but acknowledgement that sometimes survival rests not on overwhelming force but on whether one officer chooses to trust what he sees before proof arrives. By June 17th, the battle for Saipan had entered its second phase. What began as amphibious shock was now grinding attrition. The beachhead had widened enough to absorb artillery, but not enough to feel secure. Every forward position still seemed provisional. Engineers worked under fire, carving supply routes through coral so sharp it shredded boots. The air smelled constantly of cordite and limestone dust, and beneath it lingered the faint metallic odor of blood baked into rock. Japanese resistance had not collapsed. It had recalibrated. Units without the expected reinforcements were now fighting with an urgency bordering on fatalism. Bunkers were defended to annihilation. Machine gun nests were concealed within natural coral fissures, their embrasures invisible until they flashed. American units advancing inland often discovered they had stepped into carefully prepared kill zones mapped long before the invasion began. The difference now was scale. The Japanese had planned for a layered defense supported by reinforcement waves. Without that support, their counterattacks became isolated eruptions rather than coordinated thrusts. Captain Elias Boone recognized the pattern as it unfolded. Observation from elevated ridgelines allowed him to see the dispersal. enemy platoons maneuvering without the depth they had anticipated, artillery shifting prematurely from reserve to front-line exposure. The convoy's destruction had not ended resistance. It had forced resistance to reveal itself earlier than intended. And revelation in war carries cost. Boone spent those days moving between observation posts and command nodes, his field glasses rarely lowered. He developed an almost mechanical habit. Scan horizon, adjust focus, track movement, record grid reference, transmit. The act of looking became discipline. Around him, junior officers deferred to his calm cadence. They had seen the results of trusting his sight once. That memory carried weight even if unspoken. On the morning of June 18th, he detected subtle dust plumes inland, convoys of Japanese trucks attempting lateral repositioning under tree canopy. The movement was cautious, staggered, as though unsure of American air patterns. He marked their direction and passed coordinates forward. Within the hour, Marine dive bombers rolled in low, releasing ordnance that stitched the forest canopy with explosions. Again timing. Again compression of opportunity. The Americans were not simply overpowering the island. They were outpacing its adjustments. And pace had become their advantage. The Japanese command structure on Saipan, already strained by intercepted reinforcement losses, struggled to synchronize retreat and counterattack simultaneously. Reports later captured by U.S. intelligence revealed increasing friction between local commanders. Requests for artillery ammunition exceeded supply. Defensive fallback lines overlapped poorly. There were discussions of a large-scale night assault earlier than originally scheduled. The convoy that never arrived had forced these calculations forward. Boone would never read those translated reports during the war, but he sensed their effects. War produces subtle acoustic changes when coordination fails. The spacing of explosions, the irregular intervals between mortar bursts, the hesitancy of tracer arcs at dusk. These details rarely appear in official summaries. Yet men who survive long campaigns learn to read them as surely as written code. The Marines pushing toward Mount Tapachot bore the heaviest immediate cost. Coral slopes offered little concealment. Japanese defenders entrenched within natural limestone caves required engineers to approach within meters to plant demolition charges. Casualty stations filled rapidly. Here, the battle's human dimension pressed hardest. Boone visited one such aid post late on the 18th. He did not linger. Reconnaissance officers rarely did. But he observed the quiet triage, corpsmen moving steadily without dramatics, morphine syrettes inserted with efficiency, stretcher-bearers navigating shell holes. He noted how many wounded were engineers and radiomen, specialists essential to momentum. Reinforcement would have compounded those losses exponentially had the convoy reached shore. The thought did not manifest as pride. It registered as arithmetic. 1,200 additional enemy soldiers positioned correctly along these ridges would have multiplied casualties beyond the recovery threshold for several forward battalions. The beachhead stability had been thin as glass. The convoy's absence had thickened it just enough to prevent fracture. War rarely grants margins more generous than that. As June 19th dawned, the Pacific Fleet engaged in what would later be known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the larger naval confrontation unfolding concurrently. Saipan's ground campaign was now entangled with broader strategic currents. Carrier air wings roared overhead en route to intercept Japanese naval aviation. The sky itself became layered with contrails and distant flak blooms. Boone's task remained localized, yet he understood the interdependence. Saipan was not isolated geography. It was a hinge in a wider arc toward the Marianas, and from there toward Japan. Observation at ridge level influenced trajectories far beyond his immediate horizon. That understanding did not inflate his sense of importance. If anything, it sharpened his restraint. Recognition that small observations could ripple outward imposed its own gravity. On June 20th, he penned another letter home, short, measured. He described the sea again. He wrote of heat radiating from stone. He mentioned how the sky feels busy. He did not mention convoys or coordinates. He understood censorship protocols and adhered to them. Yet between the lines lay an implication. He had learned that families at home read not only what is written but what is withheld. By the end of June, Japanese organized resistance on Saipan had contracted into northern pockets. Banzai charges erupted in desperate waves. Civilians caught between retreating defenders and advancing Marines faced impossible choices. The island's limestone cliffs would soon become scenes of tragic finality. Boone's role receded from forward action as assault lines stabilized beyond his initial vantage zones. Other reconnaissance officers rotated into advanced positions. His initial observation, the convoy, became one entry among hundreds in operational logs. Yet its consequences remained embedded within unfolding success. Historians would later debate whether reinforcement arrival could have altered the island's ultimate fate. Most conclude it would not have reversed the outcome, but it might have extended the duration significantly. Extended duration means extended casualties. It means prolonged bombardment. It means a different psychological toll for both sides. Boone never participated in those debates. He had no appetite for hypothetical revisions. What occurred had occurred. What failed to arrive had failed because it was seen. On July 4th, as organized Japanese resistance collapsed in a mass final assault, Boone stood again overlooking water from a different ridge. The sea was deceptively placid, as if unwilling to reveal the weeks of violence it had absorbed. He removed his helmet briefly, letting salt air touch skin burned raw by sun and grit. Around him, men moved with exhaustion rather than adrenaline. The island was nearly secured, yet no one celebrated. Victory in the Pacific rarely presented itself cleanly. It accumulated in layers of attrition. Boone replaced his helmet and descended toward headquarters to submit another report, routine, precise, without flourish. The convoy of June 15th would not headline communiques. It would reside quietly within the architecture of the campaign. But those who traced the timeline carefully would see it. A gap where reinforcement should have been, a compression of resistance where expansion was planned, a hinge where perception intersected action. And in that hinge stood one officer on coral rock, binoculars steady, deciding to trust what he saw before the horizon confirmed it. By July 7th, Saipan no longer felt like an island being invaded. Felt like an island dying. The largest banzai charge of the Pacific War began before dawn. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many already wounded, some armed only with bayonets or grenades taped to sticks, surged forward in a final, desperate assault. The sound was not a single roar but a layered collision of screams, rifle fire, machine guns overheating, and men shouting commands in two languages that did not meet. Captain Elias Boone was not at the very tip of the line when it struck, but he was close enough to feel its impact in his bones. The ground shook, not from artillery this time, but from bodies moving in mass across coral and dust. Marines and Army units braced. Engineers, cooks, clerks, anyone capable of lifting a rifle, became part of the firing line. This was no longer maneuver warfare. This was a collision. Boone found himself positioned slightly behind a makeshift defensive arc anchored around artillery pieces that had been turned horizontal to fire directly into the oncoming charge. He watched through field glasses for seconds that felt extended beyond their natural span. The front line dissolved into smoke and flame. Japanese soldiers pushed through gaps with terrifying momentum, sometimes overrunning positions before being cut down at close range. It was chaos, but not chaos without structure. Boone did what reconnaissance officers are trained to do even in extremity. He looked for patterns. Where was the charge thickest? Where were American lines bending rather than holding? He relayed positions through runners when radio traffic became too congested to penetrate. Artillery coordinates were adjusted mid-volley. Mortar crews shifted by degrees. His voice, steady and unraised, carried through overlapping noise like a metronome against disorder. He did not fire constantly. He observed, transmitted, recalibrated. And that discipline prevented fracture. The banzai assault lasted hours. When it subsided, the ground between lines was layered with bodies so densely that movement required stepping where no one wished to step. Silence did not follow immediately. It arrived gradually, first as a reduction of volume, then as absence. Smoke lifted, Boone lowered his glasses and blinked against sweat and residue. He did not record emotional impressions. He recorded position adjustments and casualty estimates. Yet internally, he understood that this moment represented a culmination. The Japanese command on Saipan had expended what remained of organized offensive capacity. Reinforcement had not come in June, could not come now. The island's final effort had broken against defensive lines already stabilized weeks earlier. That stabilization traced backward, thread by thread, to a horizon scan on June 15th. History rarely unfolds in straight lines. It coils. Boone felt that coil tighten and release in a single morning. Later that day, he walked the ridge above the battlefield. The Pacific wind carried a strange calm, almost indifferent. War on islands possesses an intimacy continental fronts often lack. There is no vast rear area to absorb shock. Everything happens within sight of water. Boone looked toward that water again, the same expanse where he had first spotted the convoy. It appeared unchanged. Yet beneath its surface lay ships, debris, and men who had not reached shore. He felt no triumph, only recognition of connection. Had those ships landed, today's assault might have included 1,200 more voices in that charge. 1,200 more rifles. 1,200 more men were forced into collision. The margin between endurance and collapse had been thinner than any communique would ever admit. Boone removed a small notebook from his pocket, the same one he had used to sketch convoy coordinates weeks earlier. He turned to a blank page and wrote a single line. What does not arrive matters as much as what does. Then he closed it. In the days that followed, American units pushed north through diminishing resistance. Civilians emerged from caves, many in shock, some injured, others terrified by rumors spread by their own command that Americans would bring unspeakable violence. Boone witnessed Marines offering water and medical aid where possible, confusion mixing with exhaustion. War simplifies and complicates simultaneously. The convoy that never reached Saipan had been intended to reinforce defense. Its absence accelerated collapse. Collapse brought its own tragedies, cliffside deaths, families fractured by propaganda and fear. Boone understood that war's arithmetic extended beyond tactical advantage. Reinforcement denied meant one form of violence avoided and another perhaps hastened. These were not calculations he voiced. They remained internal, filed beside coordinates and casualty tallies. On July 9th, Saipan was declared secure. The official language called it victory. Strategists emphasized airfields that would soon host B-29 bombers capable of reaching Tokyo. Maps were redrawn with new arcs of range extending toward the Japanese mainland. Boone stood on a ridge as bulldozers began carving runway extensions from pulverized coral. He listened to engines rather than artillery. The sound felt almost foreign after weeks of bombardment. Engineers surveyed ground that had cost thousands of lives to hold. Boone folded his field glasses carefully and placed them into their case. His assignment on Saipan would soon conclude. There would be new islands, new horizons, new moments requiring trust in perception before confirmation. But Saipan would remain the island where a convoy turned the balance before it touched shore. That evening, he wrote another letter home to Tennessee. He described the ocean again. He mentioned that the island was quieter now. He did not claim responsibility for anything. He wrote instead about the men beside him, how steady they had been, how determined. He wrote that sometimes history changes because someone notices something early enough to matter. He did not specify further. His mother would read the letter weeks later and perhaps sense the weight between sentences. Boone sealed it without rereading. Outside his tent, the Pacific breeze carried the smell of fuel and fresh-cut coral, replacing cordite and decay. The war would continue for more than a year. But Saipan had shifted its trajectory. And somewhere beneath that shift lay a moment on a coral ridge when one officer chose to trust the thin line between suspicion and certainty, and acted before the sea could correct him. In the days that followed, Saipan did not quiet. It shifted. The ridge where Captain Elias Boone had marked that convoy became another anonymous line on a map, another elevation reference for artillery observers, another coordinate fed into typewritten summaries sent up the chain of command. But the airfield did not fall. The fuel dumps did not detonate. The temporary ammunition revetments did not burn. The convoy that had crept through cane and shadow never arrived intact. That was not an accident of weather or terrain. It was the arithmetic of timing, and Boone had forced the subtraction before it could be completed. American engineers expanded the strip faster than Japanese planners had predicted. Coral was crushed, leveled, compacted. Steel matting arrived by barge and was laid across raw earth that still smelled of damp vegetation and old blood. Within weeks, the island that had been mocked as a symbolic target became something else entirely. A runway long enough to launch bombers toward the Japanese mainland. Saipan was not merely captured. It was a range. It was rich. It was geometry bending toward Tokyo. The Japanese high command understood that shift almost immediately. Intelligence intercepts in the weeks after Saipan's fall reflected something colder than panic. They reflected recalculation. The Mariana Islands had been expected to bleed American forces, to delay, to exhaust. Instead, they had become forward platforms. The convoy Boone had seen was not just a reinforcement effort. It was part of a broader attempt to disrupt construction before those airfields became operational. Had it arrived intact, the engineers might have been forced to halt work for days, perhaps weeks. A delay of that length in July 1944 meant more than inconvenience. It meant lost tempo. Tempo is rarely visible in individual hero narratives. It hides in margins, in hours gained or lost, in trucks destroyed before unloading, in fuel that never ignites because someone saw it moving before it arrived. Boone did not know, that night on the ridge, that Saipan would become one of the principal launch points for B-29 raids against Japan. He did not know that the geometry of war was shifting. He knew only that men were moving toward something fragile and unfinished, and that if they reached it intact, the cost would be paid in American lives by morning. By August, B-29 superfortresses began staging through the Marianas. By November, long-range bombing missions were striking targets in Japan with increasing frequency. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. Names that had once felt distant even to Pacific veterans were now reachable in hours. Strategic bombing did not hinge on one convoy in one jungle valley. But strategic bombing did hinge on airfields remaining operational during the narrow window when engineers were racing to harden them. That is where Boone's moment lived, in the fragile transition between seizure and stabilization. He never claimed more than that. In post-war correspondence preserved by his family, Boone wrote of Saipan with a restraint that bordered on deflection. He described heat, exhaustion, the sound of cane burning, the smell of diesel. He mentioned the convoy only once, in a letter dated 1952, when a former enlisted man wrote to thank him for what you did that night. Boone's reply was simple. We were in position. We saw them. We did what the situation required. There was no flourish in the handwriting, no embellishment, only the quiet insistence that circumstance had dictated action. History often prefers clean arcs. The turning of a battle, the collapse of an empire, the decisive moment when a single choice rewrites an outcome. Reality resists that structure. The convoy's destruction did not end the Battle of Saipan. It did not halt Japanese resistance across the island. It did not spare the Marines from the ferocity of the final banzai charge. What it did was preserve continuity, preserve engineers at work through the night, preserve aviation fuel in storage, preserve the fragile runway long enough for it to become irreversible. By the time Saipan was declared secure in July 1944, the cost had been staggering. Thousands died on both sides. Civilians trapped between advancing lines. Entire units reduced to fragments. Boone did not stand on a triumphant hill at the end. He stood in a clearing that smelled of burnt cane and cordite, listening to bulldozers begin their work before the smoke had fully lifted. War rarely pauses for reflection. It converts ground into infrastructure and grief into logistics. From Tokyo's perspective, the fall of Saipan marked a psychological fracture. The home islands were no longer insulated by distance. Strategic bombing would escalate through 1945, culminating in devastation few planners on either side had fully envisioned in mid-1944. None of that can be reduced to one observation through field glasses. But without the runway holding, without the engineers working uninterrupted, without the convoy stopped before dawn, the timeline shifts. And in war, timelines are leveraged. Boone returned from the Pacific with little public recognition. There was no medal for spotted movement in Kane at night. There was no ceremony marking the preservation of a construction site. He resumed civilian life in Tennessee with a discipline that felt almost austere. When asked about Saipan, he did not describe heroism. He described duty performed without excess. The men who served under him remembered something different. A commander who saw beyond the immediate firefight, who understood that protecting the vulnerable margin was sometimes more consequential than charging the obvious target. The island itself transformed. Airstrips lengthened. Concrete replaced coral. What had been a battlefield became a platform for projection. The convoy Boone intercepted faded into the background of operational summaries, a footnote in daily reports. But its absence, the fuel that never burned, the ammunition that never reached the ridge, lingered invisibly in the outcome. War rarely announces its hinge points. They are discovered later, in letters and marginal notes, in recollections that resist grandeur. Boone's act was not cinematic. It was procedural. It was a calculation made in darkness with limited information and no assurance that anyone would ever understand its scale. Yet by the time American bombers appeared over Japan months later, carrying payloads that would redefine the war's endgame, the island they launched from had survived its most vulnerable night. And that survival, quiet and unrecorded beyond a line in a field log, had been secured by a captain who saw movement where others might have dismissed shadow. History would move on. But the geometry had already shifted. And it shifted because someone chose not to look away. In the years after the war, Captain Elias Boone rarely spoke of Saipan. He did not recount the convoy as a dramatic turning point. He did not describe the ridge in cinematic detail. When pressed, he would say that the Pacific had taught him the value of attention, of not allowing fatigue or heat or monotony to dull observation. The men who miss things, he once wrote to a fellow veteran, do not always get a second chance to correct it. That was as close as he came to framing the night as decisive. The letters attributed to him in later family archives carry none of the bombast that post-war memoirs often adopt. There is no moral proclamation about changing the course of history. Instead, there is an undercurrent of humility that borders on reluctance. He speaks of enlisted engineers by name, of the corporal who joked about the coral dust, of the private who carried extra water to the bulldozer crews. The convoy appears in only a few sentences. What lingers longer are descriptions of responsibility, of feeling that the men working under lantern light trusted him to see what they could not. That trust weighed more heavily than any enemy formation. Saipan itself became part of the infrastructure of escalation. The runways extended and hardened. B-29s staged in waves, engines roaring against a sky that once held only reconnaissance craft. By early 1945, those bombers would fly missions that reshaped the Pacific War irrevocably. Cities would burn. Strategic bombing would intensify. The arc from Coral Airstrip to Japanese mainland was not drawn in a single night, but it required that fragile moment of continuity to survive its first tests. Boone did not claim ownership of that arc. Nor did he need to. The British and American planners who studied the Pacific campaign later would describe Saipan as a strategic threshold. The island represented proximity, a narrowing of distance that Japan had long relied upon as a buffer. In that narrowing, the war's character changed. The convoy Boone intercepted had been one of many attempts to disrupt that transition. This failure did not end Japanese resistance, but it prevented interruption at a critical juncture. Kept the airfield operational through the night. War often reduces individual action to abstraction. Reports compress complex decisions into a handful of lines. Enemy convoy observed. Artillery adjusted. Target neutralized. What those lines do not capture is the silence before the first shell lands. The calculation of whether to wait for confirmation or act on incomplete data. The understanding that delay carries risk not only to oneself but to men working in exposed positions. In Boone's later reflections, preserved in sparse correspondence, he wrote of that silence more than of the firefight. "You listen," he noted once. and you decide whether what you hear matters enough to move on. That sentence, unadorned, might be the closest he came to articulating the night's weight. The Pacific War ended in August 1945, months after Saipan had been fully integrated into the Allied offensive framework. Boone did not remain in uniform long after victory. He returned to Tennessee, to a landscape quieter than coral fields and artillery smoke. Farming, accounting, local civic work. His post-war life bore none of the outward marks of a man who had preserved a strategic hinge. But the hinge had held. In historical retrospectives, Saipan is often cited as the moment Japan recognized that the home islands were within sustained reach. The fall of the Marianas reshaped both military planning and civilian psychology within Japan. The war's perimeter contracted. The inevitability of bombardment settled in. Strategic calculations shifted from expansion to endurance. Those shifts are rarely traced back to the granular events that made them possible. They are attributed to broad campaigns, to fleets, to divisions. Yet embedded within them are nights like Boone's, nights when a single observation prevented disruption long enough for infrastructure to solidify. There is no monument marking the ridge where he lay prone, field glasses pressed to his face. The cane has long since regrown or been replaced by roads and development. The airfield itself has evolved through decades of use and reconstruction. The coral dust that once coated engineers' boots has been paved over. What remains are letters. A captain's handwriting describing responsibility more than glory. A few lines acknowledging that he saw something and chose not to dismiss it. And the knowledge, confirmed by operational timelines, that the airstrip did not burn that night. War is often remembered through explosions and declarations. Yet its trajectory is frequently shaped by quieter acts. By the refusal to let fatigue blind perception, by the decision to act before certainty arrives, by the preservation of continuity when interruption seems imminent. Captain Elias Boone did not turn the tide of Saipan alone. He did not defeat an army single-handedly. What he did was narrower, more precise, and perhaps more enduring. He prevented a fracture in the moment when fracture would have mattered most. And because of that, when bombers lifted from the Marianas months later, engines straining toward Japan, they did so from ground that had survived its most vulnerable night. History moved forward from there, but it moved on a runway that had held.